All right, welcome to our second day of Wellness Week, the CJA Mindfulness and Wellness Committee's second day. This program is in partnership with the CLA, California Lawyers Association, and Ruth Bada will be presenting or will be here on behalf of CLA. We welcome all of you. Welcome my co-chair, Kevin Rosenberg, and he's attending right now faculty training for NJO. And also our big warm welcome to our guests, Dr. Brian Muthyala and Dr. Aguilar Ruiz, and a big thank you to them for volunteering their time to come and to provide us with such great information. Today's program will be physical stress and the food-brain connection. And at this point, I'm going to this is going to be recorded. This is recorded. It will be available on the CJA website by approximately the end of the next week. And my understanding is also going to be available on CLA. Is that correct, Ms. Bada?
Yes, that would be correct.
All right. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and turn you over to Judge Rosenberg.
Well, thank you, Judge Hunter. Did you want to do any introductions, Ms. Bada, on behalf of CLA before we jump in?
Welcome. We're really happy to see you here and welcome you on behalf of CLA. And we have amazing panelists here for all these amazing topics for the Wellness Week in Law. So welcome in.
Thank you. And I agree. And I do want to thank everybody for attending. This is really important to us as the judiciary and the California Judges Association to partner with lawyers and the California Lawyers Association, because we're all in this together, working in this incredible profession that we get to participate in. And wellness is important. We want the lawyers who are handling matters to be at their tip top. We do also. And we all share in a lot of the same stresses and triggers and needs. And so it's really special for us to continue this collaboration, which we've been doing for a couple of years. So this is a two-part session this afternoon. So first we have Dr. Muthyala, who is joining us, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. He is an internal medicine and pediatrics hospitalist at the Hennepin Healthcare and an associate professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School. He's a graduate of the University of Minnesota Medical School and has completed his internal medicine and pediatrics residency at the University of Minnesota. He has a background in trauma-informed and trauma-mitigating clinical practice and education, and works to create safe environments for his patients who have lived an experience of trauma or oppression. He's one of the current social medicine curriculum co-directors at the University of Minnesota Medical School and is the director of the Office of Health Equity and Social Justice at the Hennepin Health Center. He lives in Minnesota with his spouse, 3 children, and 1 small dog. We're also very privileged to be joined by Dr. Antonella Aguilera Ruiz. She is a neuropathic doctor based in Northern California. Her virtual clinic, Wild Lemon Health, specializes in mental health using a whole person approach. The clinic incorporates evidence-based nutrition with integrative medicine, along with group classes and mind-body medicine. After graduating magna cum laude at Santa Clara University, she earned her neuropathic doctorate from the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon. She's licensed by the California Neuropathic Medicine Committee and is also a Menopause Society certified practitioner. So we've got some fantastic professionals here. So each one of them is going to do a presentation and we'll answer questions. So if you have questions, give them about 15 minutes or so to get through their talk, and then please ask questions because they want to interact and engage with you. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Muthyala, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'll be sharing a couple of slides, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I always find myself in awe a little bit when I speak before particularly different professions. I'm a physician I know very little about the law. I know very little about the judiciary. What I've learned is through collaborations and partnerships. And what I have been struck by in my meetings with Dr. Rosenberg and teaching a session in a class for judges around sort of health and healing is just how similar the experiences shared are similar to my experiences as a physician in terms of the joys of the jobs that you all have chosen, but also some of the challenges and real sort of pain that comes from being put in approximation with sort of strong emotions, lived experiences. And so I'm just really grateful to be here. I'd love it if we were able to interact and talk. And if you're at a place where you can turn your cameras on, that'd be great. If not, I completely understand and appreciate that. And please interrupt me, raise your hands. I'll put stuff in the chat and I'll try to monitor that as best as possible. And so I'm talking about sort of a trauma-informed approach to health and healing. The first step I really want to do is just sort of get an understanding, kind of share my understanding of what trauma is. I think we all have sort of a broad understanding of what trauma can be. The classical definition is one of physical, emotional, psychological, or spiritual injury in response to a life-threatening event like an accident, abuse, violence, or natural disaster. And there's all these different types of trauma. There's this acute trauma, and that's sort of the trauma that we think about the most, the death of a loved one, an assault, a divorce, an injury, those sorts of things. There's complex trauma that are sort of exposed to multiple wide-ranging traumas. So there's this idea of intergenerational and historical traumas, where trauma is sort of passed along. I'm going to nerd out a little bit on sort of the science and the medicine of how trauma can be passed on at the genetic level, forget at the social level. And then there's system-induced trauma. So how when systems are designed ostensibly to help people, but they can re-traumatize or inflict harm on those individuals within those systems. All of those can be sort of traumatizing events. But a definition that I love and that I continue to come back to is this definition by Resmaa Menakem, who he writes something that has happened that is too much, too soon, too fast, or too long without something that was repaired. And I love this definition because it speaks to the multifaceted nature of the experience. Something that might be extremely traumatic because of my lived experience may not be to you, and vice versa. Something that might be too fast for me might be too slow for you, and something might be too slow for you is really fast for me. And so what this, I think, allows is the acceptance of the idea that just because something was easy for you, particularly when I think of sort of the intergenerational values associated with trauma in professions, it might be fast for me. So something, particularly in medicine, a field in which trauma has been perpetuated upon generation and generation of trainees and physicians, we're sort of at the point in medicine where we're saying, that stuff is too much, that was too fast. We need to start to build a repair because the impact of trauma is incredibly diverse, incredibly vast, and has deep ramifications when it comes to sort of health and well-being. And I love broadening the definition of trauma. In my job as a physician in medical school 25 years ago, when I attended medical school, I was sort of taught to ask, what's wrong with you? What's happened to you? And now in medicine, when I teach and for my patients, I'm really starting to change that fundamental question, which is what's wrong with you? What's happened to you? And understanding what has happened to my patients that are in front of me, your clients that are in front of you, I think is the key to understanding lived experience, the key to understanding so much of human behavior, the key to understanding trauma. So why does trauma matter? From a biologic standpoint, trauma impacts every organ system in our body. Our bodies were built, if you go back to high school biology, you learned about homeostasis, right? So cells are meant to sort of create a sort of equilibrium or balance. The body is meant to create homeostasis or a balance, and any sort of stress or threat alters and disrupts that balance. And so any threat sort of changes how our organs work, our heart works, our adrenal glands, our kidneys, our stomach, our intestines, everything that's sort of mediated by the nervous system, as well as mediated by our endocrine system. So the nervous system in our brain, our nervous system in our gut, the nervous system that's in our whole body, as well as the endocrine system, our brain, our thyroid gland, our adrenal glands, our stomachs, all our ovaries, our testicles, all of those things are in the response to sort of threat. And millions of years ago, when we were evolving to be the humans that we are today, our bodies evolved to navigate acute threat and stress. If there was a tiger chasing us, our body's physiology changed to adapt to that. Blood went away from our stomach and into our muscles so that we didn't need to digest. We needed to run away. We needed to fight, those kinds of things. Today, those threats of lions and tigers, that physical threat of violence is not as strong, but the repeat and chronic exposure to stress, to threat, and I tend to use some of those terms interchangeably. Stress or threat has the same physiologic response as if we were being chased by a bear. And so I tell my kids, right, if you're nervous before something, that's a real feeling, right? It's not that you've made it up, it's that your body is responding to stress and threat in a certain way. And this is mediated by multiple organs in your body. It's mediated in your brain. So the impact of stress and trauma has been studied to impact memory, cognition, thought, impulse control. All of these things is mediated by our responses to threat. And as I said, there's robust literature that actually we have our genetic, our genetics are passed on from our parents to us in the womb. But there's a tremendous amount of literature that's saying that exposure to trauma, even in the womb, can change some of the ways in which our genetics manifest themselves, change some of the way that our genetics interact with each other, that can lead down the road to increased diagnoses of anxiety, depression, bipolar, and frankly, health, medical issues, as well as physical issues, as well as behavioral health issues. And so all of this is to sort of say that there's this tremendous wealth of literature that is showing us that this exposure to fight or flight stress responses, and I'm sort of simplifying here, especially over time, can lead to stress and disease. So this is a real thing that impacts the health of my patients that I think about every day, the health of my colleagues who are under a strong degree of stress and threat every day. And if your job is a stressful one, if your job puts you in approximation to people who have experienced a large amount of stress or threat, which many of you do, just being adjacent to that stress or threat can lead to these sort of changes in your body's nervous system and endocrine system. When I think about simplistically, when I'm talking to patients or to my students, I sort of give them this idea of the thinking brain versus the survival brain. The thinking brain is a rider horse. So a horse that's sort of going along, it's in control, our brains are in control of our bodies. It makes informed, rational decisions. And then a threat comes along and it knocks that rider off. And now that horse is bucking. And now that horse is in its survival mode. It's using protective instincts that are based on feeling to keep it safe. And what's really important to understand is that both of these are really important. If I didn't run away instinctively if I'm being chased by the bear, I'm going to be in trouble. If I'm unable to make rational and informed choices under stress or threat, I'm going to be in trouble. So both are normal parts of our brain, but it's really important to try to understand, well, how can I make sure that I'm in survival brain when I need to be? How can I make sure that I'm in my thinking brain mode when I need to be, particularly in moments of stress and threat? And I take care of patients. So I work at the Safety Net Hospital in Minneapolis. I take care of patients. It's a trauma center. So the patients I'm taking care of are oftentimes under some degree of stress. Anytime you're in the hospital, it's a scary experience. And what I see every day are survival brain people who, because of the intrinsic stress and threat of being sick, being scared, of being afraid, of being cared for in a hospital where they don't look like anybody that looks like them, they are in a threat-based mindset. And a threat-based mindset, you all are probably pretty familiar with what that can look like. A threat-based mindset can look like someone who's angry and upset and fighting, somebody who tries to be avoidant, who flights or who runs away, whether that's physically running away or tries to avoid the topic. Many of my patients, they freeze up. They don't even hear when I give them a life-changing diagnosis. Many of my patients are present. They're here, they're listening, but they don't hear, they don't take in anything that I have said to them because they're so afraid of the diagnosis that I've just given them. And then there's sort of fawning, which is sort of a purposeful, sort of performative surface level agreement of just trying to get through a really negative experience that I see oftentimes playing itself out in sort of the professional setting. So there are all these sort of ways and mindsets in which trauma can impact the way in which we act. And what's really important is just the idea that there are people that are exposed to chronic stress and threat over and over and over and over again. So then they start to look at the world and see it through the lens of trauma. They start to see people who they've never met, but might remind them of somebody who hurt them or hurt their family member. And then they act in a certain way. So when I take care of patients, I'm really mindful of the idea that the medical system has harmed brown and Black people for hundreds of years. And so I might look like somebody who hurt a patient's family member, their auntie, their uncle, their grandma, their grandpa, their kids. And so I have to take that into account, that just my very presence might be a threatening experience for somebody. I need to understand that, recognize the trauma response, and sort of attend to that. And so, but where I wanted to sort of spend a little bit of our time is really thinking about, well, what does it mean if these are natural feelings, these are normal experiences, if a trauma response is a natural, normal experience to threat, and if my job is threatening all the time or stressful all the time, then what does that mean? For me, how do I navigate a natural, normal physiologic response? And there's the literature is robust, but I sort of tend to break it down into 3 different ways. And so there's sort of to achieve emotional regulation, which is our goal, ways to regulate this natural physiologic response are sort of, there's 3 buckets. There's the embodiment, there's the physical, and then there's the cognitive. So the physical is sort of this idea, well, we have to attend to our basic human needs. So how many of us eat healthy, exercise regularly, get 8 hours of sleep, are able to do all of those things every day? Very few of us, right? But how can we attend to those as much as possible? I work nights. So my shift that I work is usually from about 9 p.m. till about 7 a.m. How can I maintain a natural and normal physical health despite that sort of work environment? The second is sort of a cognitive approach, or what are some cognitive approaches to really being present and mindful in the moment so I can understand what's going on in my body and attending to that. And the last one, which I think is probably, to me, is the most important personally, is the idea of embodiment. So I didn't go into this in terms of the literature, but there are ways to change our human physiology. There are ways to lower our heart rate. There are ways to lower our breathing rate. There are ways to put the rider back onto the horse. If you're familiar with the idea of square breathing or breathing exercises, if you're familiar with body scans, there are a myriad of ways to say, I am in a dysregulated place. Being in a dysregulated place leads me to make decisions that aren't in my best interest or in my patient's best interest or my client's best interest. So how can I bring myself back onto that embodied place so that I can be emotionally regulated? And those are things I think about all the time. If I'm going to go in at 2 a.m. and talk to a patient who's scared, who's upset, who's frustrated, and I'm talking to them in a dysregulated way, if I'm a riderless horse, well, and they're a riderless horse, not 2 riderless horses talking to each other, is probably not going to go well. And you all can probably recall experiences in your professional careers where it was 2 dysregulated people, and how well did that go? And at least for me, with my patients, I don't expect my patients to be gracious all the time. They're scared, they're upset, they're hurt. They may not have the capacity in that moment to be regulated. So what is my capacity to put my rider back on my horse, to maintain an emotional regulation despite the threat and stress of the patient experience that's happening around me? And because the goal that I see as a physician is there's a stimulus that leads to dysregulation. But between the stimulus and the response, there's space. And that space is the power and the freedom, I think, of what we're trying to get at. And so how can you all start to expand that space? How can you maintain that emotional regulation so that you are able to be the best, most intuitive rider horses in caring for the people that you're caring for, both in your professional space as well as in your personal space? The data and literature on kind of mitigated trauma, sort of metabolized trauma is really strong and robust. Exposure to chronic stress is bad for you. But we know that without a doubt, exposure to chronic stress can lead to hypertension, diabetes, sleep disruptions, mental health disorders, you sort of name it. Exposure to chronic stress is bad for the human body. Our bodies didn't evolve to navigate that chronic stress. And so how can we all as a community begin to understand the process of emotional regulation as a first step to healing? You know, people experiencing trauma, whether that's clients, whether that's judges, whether that's attorneys, it's just people manifest trauma responses in many different ways, and understanding what it is in you is really important. I know what my trauma response is. I want to run away. I want to run away from my problem. I want to run away from scary things. I want to run away from threat. And so I have to mitigate that natural physiologic response to threat in real time to do my job well. The same thing goes for me. I'm the parent of young kids. Every day I'm dealing with dysregulated human beings. And so how can I, if I yell at my kids when they're being dysregulated, it's not going to go very well. So how can I work to build that emotional resiliency for myself and those tools and those skills to regulate myself? So acknowledging our own threat response is really important to navigating sort of threatening and stressful encounters in sort of our professional world. Understanding that physiologic response to threat is really important. It's natural. Being being threatened is human. And so navigating that human physiologic response is really important to preventing and mitigating the damage that chronic stress and threat can cause. And so developing those tools is really, really important. Are those tools embodiment? Is it ensuring that your sleep and exercise and nutrition is on point? Is it developing the cognitive tool to really navigate specific moments in real time? All of those are really, really important tools that I could talk for hours about if given the time, but it will be up to all of us to sort of build those tools out to sort of change the culture. I think one of the things that I've sort of taken away from my conversation is the legal world is very similar to the medical world. There's a lot of toxicity, there's a lot of trauma embedded in the structures and systems. And so if we're able to sort of mitigate some of those things for ourselves, that's the first step to being able to sort of change the culture and change sort of our professions for the betterment of those of us who are working within them and for the people whom we're trying to serve. So thank you.
Wow, thank you for that. That is just phenomenal. We've got a few minutes before we're going to hand it over to Dr. Aguilar Ruiz. So if anyone has any questions, this is designed to give you an opportunity to ask questions directly of Dr. Muthyala. While we're waiting for some folks to be brave, let me ask you this. You mentioned something about breathing. I mean, in your experience and based on the research, do you think something as simple as, you know, a minute, 60 seconds of a box breathing type of a thing would bring down, you know, the physiological effects of what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so to give you an example, there are certain types of heart arrhythmias, a heart rate is going 160 beats a minute. The thing that we learn before medicines, before drugs, there are actually these physiologic maneuvers that we can do to slow that arrhythmia down. It's actually mitigated by the vagus nerve, which is a big nerve that sort of connects a lot of different organs in your body. You can do massage, you can put your face in an ice bath, you can do some deep breathing exercises. All of those activate the vagus nerve to lower down some of the stress responses in the human body. So I do that a lot. I don't have like hours and hours and hours to meditate. I wish I did, but I might have a minute as I'm walking to a patient room that I know is going to be a stressful encounter. I might have 30 seconds while I'm walking in a stairwell or between patients, all of those things. So the key is absolutely is what can you do within our context of our work or our lives or whatever. And I think absolutely 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes here or there is a real opportunity to I think to change our physiology so that we can sort of be more present.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have a hand up from Yuridia Guerrero.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I just was wondering if maybe you could speak on how trauma relates to burnout, if there's a relationship between the two, or if there's separate things that develop separately.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, I can say absolutely that trauma is connected to burnout. The burnout literature probably says that there's an aspect of depersonalization that is part of burnout. And trauma is a real big part of that. I mean, like for physicians, sort of the big traumatic experience was COVID. It was incredibly painful. It was incredibly traumatic. People quit, people left. The mental health crisis that forget people and patients and families, but the mental health crisis in medicine hasn't recovered from sort of the stress and threat. And if it has, it's because it's not that we've dealt with it, it's that we're really good at just like shoving it down and going on to the next patient. I have a lot of stories of that sort of what I was taught to do. You see something awful and terrible, and then you just move on to the next thing. And without metabolizing that experience, without working through it in real and meaningful ways with friends, family, it doesn't, it could be a lot of people. I think we're at really risk for harm to ourselves as humans and as to our bodies. And absolutely, we have a risk for leaving the profession. There's a question in the chat about checking cortisol level. There's no literature on cortisol level, and mainly because cortisol is normal. And so typically there's a natural cyclical variation to checking cortisols. And so we typically don't tend to think of that as a measurable thing in sort of a screening test sort of way. There are absolutely starting to become validated measures for trauma, for stress, and even things that are sort of mitigated or hidden. So there are some validated survey instruments around the experience of the exposure to chronic racism, for example, chronic sexism. So that literature absolutely does exist. And I would say people who screen positive with those are probably at higher risk to some of the things we're talking about. And I wouldn't necessarily choose a biochemical marker to say somebody is at risk for health complications from chronic stress or not.
And Dr. Muthyala, part of that question was also how you can alter cortisol levels.
Oh, sure. I think that it is these tools, I'm not familiar, there may be some literature on sort of like meditation or certain like of these sort of skills to lower cortisol in the acute setting. I think more about like, how do I change the phenotype, right? If I'm a riderless horse, how do I change that? Again, I don't need a biochemical marker to tell me if I'm stressed out or not. I know. And so how do I build the skills in the toolbox? Again, I think about before an incident, during, and then after, and all of those are different skills. It might be box breathing in the moment. It might be preparation before, and then it might be like debriefing afterwards. But how can we start to build that into our culture? Like when I was a trainee, we didn't debrief like stressful event. The patient died, something horrible happened, it was next patient. What is the culture of debriefing? What is the culture of community that we that you all have in your professional world? And I would encourage you all to lean into those things, because we're finding, and we're behind. I would say medicine is behind like the other professional, like every professional group that works in high stress systems has this built in. Athletes do this, performers do this. Many high performance, high stress professions do this cognitive emotional regulation work. Physicians do not. And so I think there are absolutely professions that we can learn from to help us build those emotional regulation skills.
That's fantastic. There's a question in the chat from David Munoz about asking how we can try to get high conflict litigants to regulate their emotions during hearings. I mean, I think
that must be so hard. That must be so hard. The only analogy I can give is to one of patients, right? When patients are upset or angry or scared or frustrated, I imagine this is why I love talking in front of you all, is because I think there's a lot of similarities, right? The work is different, but sort of the context may be very similar. I think, are there moments that you can ask people to sort of pause? I think I told a story to Judge Rosenberg. I absolutely can recall a patient who was shaking because she was so angry and she wanted to fight. And I like to say the quiet part out loud. That's sort of how I deal with a lot of stressful situations. And I just said, like, look, this is the first time we're meeting. You look like you want to fight me. I don't want to. I don't want to fight you. And so let me tell you where I'm coming from. Let's take a little break, and then I'm going to come back. And now that may not work in all settings. That may not work in all situations. This patient was not critically ill enough that I had to, work right away. I could take a pause and come back. We teach our medical students sort of co-regulation techniques. So how do you, more than just de-escalation, how can you, if you're regulated, how can you regulate with somebody? I think about that with my kids a lot. There's nothing that's going to tell my 6-year-old to de-escalate her, but can I co-regulate with her? Can I give her the models? Can I show her the things that I'm doing? Can I help her get there? Can I help her build the tools that's a lifetime of work. When you're in a courtroom, you probably don't have that sort of longitudinal opportunities. But absolutely, I have taken a pause, taken a step back, called out what I'm seeing in the room. And then I've sort of recognized the part of like, it's probably really normal to be scared. It's probably really normal to be, upset or angry. And so I think thinking about, yeah, what are the ways we can sort of slow down, tell everybody to take a break. I would love to be able to do square breathing or some breathing technique with all my patients. Haven't gotten there yet, but someday maybe. But I think what are the ways, and I think the other part is, and I don't know what it's like for you all, but I think showing how can you really quickly and authentically show somebody that you care about them, I think goes a really long way to sort of de-stressing them. And what are the simple and small ways? So like I have my way. Again, I see patients in the emergency room at 2 a.m. What is the simple 3 phrases that I use every time I interact with somebody that I hope is going to just take the temperature down? What are the ways that we can take these systems that I think, again, I don't know much about the judicial system, but I think our system, our forward-facing systems are sort of cold and they're clinical, at least in the medical world. What are the ways that I can create a bit of softness in a moment between 2 individuals that can hopefully mitigate some of that, the rough nature of our systems, I think can go a really long way as well.
Yeah, there's some really good comments in the chat on this. And so thank you so much. This is fantastic. I would just say, for our judicial colleagues and counsel, there are things we can do, like just for our judicial colleagues, welcome people to the courtroom, say good morning. Maybe for counsel, just take a breath with your client before you walk in the courtroom, following a lot of Dr. Muthyala's advice. So thank you. So, and just to let everyone know, I have to myself get off of this in about 15 minutes, but Judge Honer will be standing by to wrap everything up. I'm in the middle of a training, so I'll thank both of our presenters again profusely. Let's turn it over now, please, to Dr. Aguilar Ruiz.
All right, thank you. So I'm just going to get my slides going here. All right, so hopefully you guys can see that. Yes? Okay, awesome. Okay, so let me all right, so I'm going to talk all about food and mood, which is going to fall under this umbrella of nutritional psychiatry. We'll also touch on the gut-brain connection, but I want us to talk about the background and the framework with which we're going to think about all of these things, but I also want to spend time mostly on conditions, like how does this apply practically in our lives. And so we already did introductions. I'm just going to clarify that I'm a naturopathic doctor, not a neuropathic doctor, just for clarification's sake. But I want us to look at nutritional psychiatry, sort of define this, then how this lives within lifestyle medicine. Then we'll go into buckets, sort of look at anxiety and the data there, as well as depression, and then stress and burnout. And then that will leave us some time for Q&A. And then actually, I can't see your guys' faces, which is feeling odd. So let me make sure it's in the right spot. Okay. All right, so as we get started talking about this topic, I really want us to lean into complexity. I don't want you to leave here and think someone's experiencing depression or anxiety because they haven't eaten enough blueberries, right? That isn't really the connection we're talking about here in terms of food and mood. But this model of looking at our concerns as much as our mental fitness, as well as mental health concerns through this biopsychosocial model, I think is the most beneficial. So we're not going to have time to go into this in tremendous detail, but I just want us to really think that this is a complex topic. There are lots of factors at play when we talk about mental health, and it's not reduced to just biology or just our psychology or social factors. It's really the interaction of all of those things. As well as the role of trauma, of course, that we talked about earlier. And that the relationship to food can really be messy. That when we're literally sitting at the table, so many things come into play. There might be socioeconomic factors, things like access to food or food deserts, our current health risks, our future health risks, how comfortable we feel in the kitchen, our religious or ethical preferences. And so again, this just isn't a simple topic. We're not going to delve into it in so much depth, but I just want to appreciate that it's messy and complex. So what is nutritional psychiatry? So this is an area of research and now I think more clinical focus and specialty within psychiatry. But at its basis, it's really this question, this inquiry, and how does food, nutrition, to a certain extent, supplementation, prevent or treat mental health concerns? And so some practitioners are starting to specialize in this area, but there's an emerging area of research really looking at these connections. What's interesting is that while this is gaining a lot more momentum, we mechanistically don't quite understand what's going on, but we have some ideas, and they fall into, I'm going to say, these 4 buckets. So from a gut-brain perspective, I think a lot of us have experienced this just in our real lives, right? We get news that is like a sucker punch to the gut, or news that makes you want to vomit. We see IBS, like irritable bowel syndrome, and mental health conditions travel together. And there's a literal physiological connection between the gut and the brain. And we know that there's a 2-way connection, up from those control centers in the brain, through the vagus nerve, down to the gut, and then right back up from the gut up to the brain. Part of this is likely mediated through our gut microbiota, so the gut bacteria and that gut flora, and regulating the immune system and inflammation. So we know that this is at play, and we're starting to learn more and more how this is actually playing out in real life. That second bucket, where nutrition is likely having a big impact, is in inflammation. So there's this growing understanding that at some level, in terms of mental health conditions, there's likely an element of neuroinflammation or brain inflammation that's happening. And as we move away from a highly processed, high sugar, high fat, high additive diet, more towards a whole food-based diet, that we're really tipping those scales towards a more anti-inflammatory fuel. And that's going to make a difference in terms of inflammation in the body and inflammation in the brain or at the nervous system level. Then another aspect that food might be making a difference here is in terms of nutritional deficiencies. So if you take a high calorie diet that's high in fat, high in processed foods, it might actually be nutritionally not very dense. And so we don't actually have that raw material that our biochemistry in our body needs to function optimally. So as we move towards a more whole food based diet, that we're repleting some of those nutritional deficiencies. There also might just be dietary patterns that are not as rich in certain nutrients. So if we take a vegan diet, for example, that might be lower in iron or zinc or B12, nutrients that are really important to brain health. If we look through a nutritional psychiatry perspective or lens, we are able to replete those elements either through supplementation or tweaking the diet and repleting those nutrients. And then the final bucket sort of that we're thinking through of like mechanistically, how can this be working out in our bodies and out in the real world, is through something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is essentially a protein that's involved through survival of neurons and the development of new ones. So it's really helping rebuild brain architecture and making the brain more neuroplastic. So we'll touch on BDNF again when we start talking about fish in the Mediterranean diet, but I think it's one of those like really cool things because that's where we see, for example, like chocolate raises BDNF levels, and that might be part of why it's helping restructure the brain. Okay. All right, so what's exciting, I think, in the field of nutritional psychiatry and this food and mood connection is that it's starting to really gain more prime time. And so recently in 2022, there were actual clinical guidelines that came out on how to use lifestyle as part of our treatment approach to mental health conditions. So I really just wanted to give us like where we're living in this ecosystem, but now that there's clinical guidelines for doctors and practitioners, it really helps us orient that there's something here, right? There's enough literature and sort of robust data behind this to make it viable in practice and as a complement to standard and conventional care. But just to say, right, that these dietary interventions that we're talking about today are really sitting within this greater ecosystem of lifestyle in a very holistic sense of looking at exercise, community engagement, social interaction, access to green space, right? Sleep, exercise. And so we're really just honing in on the dietary part of this. All right, so first up, we're going to look at anxiety. I sort of chose the big buckets that I thought would be places where we could really identify and see ourselves in. So anxiety, for a long time, there was a lot of talk in the literature of the best diet for anxiety, if you will. And wasn't until 2023 that we finally had enough to say we're probably looking at a Mediterranean diet, that this is the pattern that is most likely beneficial for anxiety. Don't worry, we will go into this in a lot more detail. But from like a big pattern perspective, we're really looking at the Mediterranean diet. This is also a diet that is a healthy eating pattern for heart health and longevity, right? So if we're maybe not doing it just for anxiety, we would be getting benefit for other conditions. The other area where I thought might be interesting for us to focus on was fermented foods. So there is growing data on probiotics and specific strains of probiotics and how that can help anxiety or other mental health conditions like depression. Really wanted us for the scope of today to really focus in on food. So our food source of those probiotics would be fermented foods. And here's where the data actually gets sort of messy. But back in 2015, we looked at fermented food consumption and found that people who had more fermented foods that actually lowered their social anxiety. Then we looked at this again at medical students who were preparing for an exam. So they had this acute stress. And what was really interesting in the first finding was that those who had more fermented foods, and so this was a mix of like fermented veggies and fermented dairies and fermented drinks, they actually had increased anxiety and depression. So this group sort of scratched its head and was like, that seems weird. Let's go back to the data. And so they went back to that data and they actually split people into psychiatrically well and psychiatrically ill. And what they found were that in the people who were psychiatrically ill, the fermented foods helped with depression, but it didn't necessarily help with their anxiety. So another group was actually looking at students, again, preparing for an exam, and they found that those who increased their consumption of fermented dairy, more specifically, that was associated with less anxiety. So I think right now, like where the literature stands, fermented foods are probably a maybe. This is really messy data because one, these people didn't have generalized anxiety disorder as a diagnosis. It was an acute stress for like 7 days, or they're prepping for an exam. And we might actually be seeing a difference in the type of fermented foods. Like maybe there's something special about fermented dairy that we still need to study and research to really hone in on. So probably not harmful, even though the healthy people did see increased anxiety and depression. But a maybe, and if anxiety is something you're struggling with, maybe it's more specific about fermented dairy for the most part. But where things are a lot more clear is in caffeine. So this, for a long time, maybe sounded like a myth out in the world, or we also could feel that our anxiety would go up when we had caffeine. But in 2024, we were able to like really hone in, like, where is this pivot point? Like, where does caffeine become a problem? And when does it increase our risk of anxiety? So we were able to see that it's about at the 400 milligram mark, that if you stay below that, you have a moderate risk of increased anxiety. But if you go over those 400 milligrams, it is extremely significant how it's going to increase your risk of anxiety. So I gave some examples here of typical sort of caffeine doses, if you will. So you can see drip coffee will vary depending on how it's brewed or the type of coffee. And so you can see how, like, even at 3 cups of coffee a day, you're getting mightily close to those 400 milligrams. So if anxiety is something that's a common experience or a diagnosis, I would say you generally just want to stay clear of that 400 milligram mark. So it doesn't mean no coffee at all, but you definitely want to stay on the lower end. And if you're continuously going over 400 milligrams and experiencing a lot of anxiety, this can be one way where food and adjusting and really dialing it back can make a big difference. Okay, so now we're going to talk about depression and sort of the food aspect here. And what's, I think, really exciting about depression specifically in terms of the data is that we're starting to get the randomized control trials. So a lot of the anxiety data is that we follow people for 2 years or 20 years or 15 years. We ask them what they ate during that time. We see how much anxiety they had, or this can happen also in observational studies in depression. But right, we're seeing a population, observing them over time, and then starting to say like, oh, these people who ate lots of vegetables had less of this or more of this. Instead, in depression, we actually have studies where we have a group of people who are diagnosed or report as feeling depressed, and then we have a control group, and we're able to give that other group the intervention and compare them at the end of the studies. And so in depression, we actually have quite a few of those bigger randomized controlled trials. I listed here the most significant. There is another one that was just a very brief study over 3 weeks that isn't here in case you're super interested. We can talk about that during the Q&A. But the first trial here is the SMILES trial. This was done in Australia, and those participants had moderate to severe depression. They could be, to be in the study, they could actually be on their normal medication, or they could be in therapy, or both. And then they were taught the Mediterranean diet over 12 weeks, and they were giving food pantries, and they met with a health coach to help them implement that dietary pattern. And then at the end of the study, the Mediterranean diet group had a 32% remission rate, while the control group only had an 8% remission rate. This was then followed up by the Healthy Med study that was looking at the Mediterranean diet with fish oils. But again, it was an intervention group. Those people had moderate depression, and then they received this Mediterranean diet treatment for 3 months. And by the end of the study, they had a 1.68 times greater improvement in their mood. And then it was even maintained up to 6 months later when they looked at them again. And then most recently, there's the AMEND trial, which was on young men who had been diagnosed by their medical doctors to have moderate or severe depression. And by the end of that study, which was 3 months as well, 36% of the participants went from their like moderate or severe, they went down into that lower minimal depression category, versus nobody in the control group jumped down in terms of how severe their depression was. Okay, so overall, right, all roads are leading to the Mediterranean diet, but there's something interesting here about the fish specifically. So there's definitely a body of literature on omega-3s and using them in mental health. But again, I really wanted us to focus in on the food and like, what is it in this pattern that might be that like extra piece that is actually quite important? So for this, we need to look at more of those observational trials that I had mentioned. But what's interesting is that we're seeing them actually in different parts of the world and seeing very similar patterns emerge. So if we take Spanish university students, they had low fish consumption and they had a higher risk of depression. A large Korean study found that especially women, if they had more than 4 servings of fish per week, it lowered their depression risk. And then the US data was very similar in that women, especially if they had low fish consumption, that increased their depression risk. And why I mentioned this and why I went through the trouble of talking through that BDNF piece is that the omega-3s in fish raise BDNF levels. So this might be mechanistically from a food perspective that if we're able to have more fish in the diet, it helps really support that neuroplasticity and that ability to repair that architecture of the brain. And so this is just to give you an idea of the food pyramid that they used in that SMILES trial. So you can see fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes. I will just note that they used a little bit more meat than would be in a traditional Mediterranean diet to get some of those, what they felt in the study were like brain nutrients like iron, zinc, and vitamin B12. But we'll come back to this to sum everything up at the very end. Okay, so the final topic I want us to touch on is stress and burnout. Just to like differentiate quickly that stress and burnout are actually not synonymous. So stress is really that feeling of overwhelm, sort of that feeling that we experience when we don't know if we can quite meet the challenge. Whereas burnout is really an occupational hazard that has emotional exhaustion, mental distancing, or cynicism with one's job, and that lack of personal efficacy and accomplishment, where we feel like no matter how hard we work, how well we do, we're just not achieving at the level we want to achieve. And the short story here, again, is the Mediterranean diet, that a lot of this research has been done in healthcare practitioners, but I think it applies to similar populations that have similar sorts of stresses. But we're not now starting to get the data out of COVID that, for example, nurses who had followed a Mediterranean diet were 50% less likely to experience burnout. So diet can play a role here. But in burnout specifically, I think even though it's the content of the food, it's also more that institutional or systems level change or how we eat. It's healthy food available in cafeterias. It's time for meals as well as meal timing. So making sure that you're not going lots and lots of hours without fueling, that there's regular meal times, that you're able to take a break to eat and to eat uninterrupted. So adding an aspect of that mindful eating component instead of being at the computer or reading or talking or in a meeting while you eat. So a little bit of a nuance there on the how we eat, in addition to just the food stuff. And then finally, in terms of stress, right, just the experience of stress, that higher intakes of fruits and vegetables can really be protective and help make us more resilient to that perceived stress response. And essentially, a big study in Australia found that people who ate the rainbow, so apples, pears, bananas, cruciferous vegetables, had lowered perceived stress level scores. And then just as we finish up here, I do just want to have a word on the Mediterranean diet before we open this up to questions, and that I really want you to think of it as a pattern. It doesn't necessarily have to be specific or true to the Mediterranean. So if you think of legumes, something like lentils, that might be a dal if you're using Indian flavors, or it might be lentils and rice like majadra in the Middle East, or a lentil soup in the south of Spain. In the American South, it might be red beans and rice, or it might be tofu in Asian cultures, that this cuisine is a pattern and we can adapt it to flavors that feel true to our likes, our kitchen of origin, etc. So just to sum up that final pyramid with everything we talked about is here we've got those fruits and vegetables from a stress perspective, maybe leaning into fermented dairy or around the anxiety. I think more data will start to support that in the coming years. And really going more towards 2 to 4 servings of fish potentially from a depression perspective, and then limiting caffeine if anxiety is of a concern. All right, so I think that brings us to the end, just to be respectful of time. And I did see the chat, but haven't read it. So I'm happy to hop in there in case there are any questions.
There are a few questions.
Okay.
I think one was from earlier on about, this is from Don Biddleson, said they had seen many things about cortisol and menopause and complications for women. Is this a real thing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's actually, I think, a little bit of nuance here because there's almost like a fear factor in the social media world or the wellness world that like, oh my gosh, cortisol is just gonna like make everything go haywire. In that like menopausal experience, those fluctuating hormones of estrogen and progesterone as they change, they are experienced as stressful by the nervous system. So part of that is going to be mediated by cortisol. But I would say part of it is like in midlife, there's lots of factors. There are those physiological factors that are affecting us from a hormonal level. And cortisol is essentially like a bystander. And then there's like life stressors that are happening that are also going to be cortisol mediated. But I think we spend a lot of time just like thinking about cortisol when it's one, we can like take the edge off that progesterone estrogen shift, be that through lifestyle, foundational pieces that might be like menopause hormone therapy, looking at stress in general. But it isn't so much just manipulating the cortisol, but I also think it's an opportunity to sort of figure out that like new set point of resilience within this like greater time that can be particularly stressful with like a career, taking care of aging parents, if you've got kids at home, etc. So cholesterol gets a bad rap. It's definitely at play, but it's more about creating, I think, resilience in that hormonal system to those stresses.
Another question from David Gottlieb. What about creatine? Is it helpful? Or creatine? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah. I think it depends for what you're using it for. There is discussion that like it's almost an essential nutrient when it comes to mental health. So if diets are maybe lower in animal protein and there aren't quite as many sources, that creatine can definitely be an add-in. I mostly work with women, and I will say I use it quite frequently in practice, especially for like workout recovery. It's a really great tool in midlife for like low energy. Even in the presence of poor sleep, it can really help people feel more clear-headed and have better energy during the day. So I think it's definitely something that can be of play. You just sort of want to know what you're using it for and if there's a reason to use it in that particular circumstance.
And is that in any particular types of food that you would?
Yeah, so it's mostly in animal protein, yeah, where you would find it. So, there is a little bit of a discussion that if those sources aren't like naturally in the diet, if we should supplement. And women's brains especially do seem to be pretty sensitive to creatine levels. And there's a little bit of a discussion as well that you can load in to help increase or make faster sort of the response to antidepressants. And so there's an interesting interaction there from a mental health perspective.
Is all fish equal in terms of benefits? That's from Judge Ueda.
Yeah, so I would say we're really probably leaning more on the cold water fish from a health perspective. So those that are higher in the omega-3s. So mostly in these diets, it's been things like sardines and anchovies, salmon in the Nordic diet. I think fish is just such a complicated topic because there's also the environmental concerns. But from a health perspective, we're looking at those like cold water fish, lower on the food chain, but they're also a great replacement for saturated fat. So then that opens up shrimp, mussels, clams, etc. It just makes that category much wider as well.
I think you answered a couple of these questions in your last answer. Does the discussion regarding recommended fish servings take into account mercury or other concerns or toxins? I think you had answered that. Anything else you wanted to address regarding that?
Yeah, I would say I would call that almost more like a living question, right? Because I think sometimes we can't talk about food without talking or thinking through the environmental impacts, right? And there's like overfishing and there's contamination in the ocean, et cetera. And from these studies, especially out of the Mediterranean, they would be small fish. So a lot of sardines, a lot of anchovies. Although all that being said, like Spaniards eat a lot of tuna, which would be a high mercury fish as well. So I think we're just trying to apply like the best that we know now, like trying to look at like the Monterey Bay Aquarium is a great resource. There's also NRDC Seafood Watch. That's a great resource. Trying to opt for things that are lower mercury and keeping those servings into those recommendations. So like tuna, for example, I think they recommend once a month or a couple times a month because I've definitely seen mercury levels increase if people are having a lot of those higher mercury fish. And so obviously we don't want to like do well by eating lots of fish and then have a mercury issue on the other side.
And then we have, what about shellfish, shrimp, and lobster? I think that was in relation to are all fish equal in terms of benefits?
Yeah, so they're not going to be as high in the omega-3s, but they're also great sources of lean protein. So fish is sort of hitting two things functionally in the diet. Like one, it can be a source of lean protein that's lower in saturated fat and a source of omega-3s. So the shellfish sort of bridges some of like both those worlds.
There's a question, what if you can't eat fish? Are omega-3s enough? I guess that would be supplements.
Yeah, so I think there could be cause to supplement with omega-3s. I will just say that not all omega-3s are created equal. And so we're starting to learn, right, that EPA and DHA, which are two different types of omega-3s, that there's like specificity around that. Like when we look at the data, sometimes it looks like it's helpful, sometimes it looks like it isn't, but it's really that like EPA and DHA. And then you don't necessarily want to do very high doses without consultation of a practitioner, because we're starting to learn that there can be an increased risk of atrial fibrillation once we go past a certain number of grams.
And this is a question that I have. What is we're talking about the EPA and DHA. What is What is that with respect to omega-3?
Yeah, so it's like there's like omega-3 is the category up here, and then we've got EPA and DHA. So they're like essentially like just like two different types of omega-3s. And so like when we're looking at them, sometimes we want them to be like more EPA or more DHA. Like it gets into a lot of nuance. Like for a certain condition, we might actually want more DHA than EPA. And so that's where mostly you just want a good practitioner who's sort of up to date on the data so that you can choose the right omega-3 for the issue at hand.
Okay, wasn't sure what that stood for. What was the DHA?
Yeah, it's like echo. We're going into deep into chemistry now, and I'm gonna mispronounce them and not like totally. Yeah, I will totally flub them.
There's a few more questions. I guess a lot of people have some questions here. Is there a good substitute for fish in a Mediterranean diet?
Which is like, would it still be like within the animal proteins or just like a whole substitution?
I'm not sure. This
that.
is Lauren Lofton. Lauren, did you wanna, if you're there, Lauren, you wanna clarify? I'm not sure if Lauren is being shy.
Sure.
Either way.
Sure, I'm here. It was just as an alternative to protein. I think you already answered it. If someone can't eat fish, for example, what's a good protein other than maybe legumes or eggs? And I don't know that there would be a good substitute based on what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like I think there's just that question, right? That like, is there a good substitute? And like, the more we know that like what we're missing, right, it would walk us into what those potential substitutes are. And so, all the things you named, eggs. I think we also sometimes underappreciate the dairy aspect, right, from a calcium as well as a protein perspective, and give some vegetarian options there, like non-animal protein, well, sort of animal protein, but in a different sense. And so, yeah, I think that's the one. We're like trying to learn, like, how do we sub, or if this is absent, like, what is the thing? Like, what is the thing here that we're really missing? And that's what's hard in nutrition research, is that like the sum is bigger than its parts. So like sometimes when we just take one of the nutrients out, we sort of don't know what we're leaving behind. And that's, I think, the question that we're learning.
And I think we have time for one more. What are your thoughts on fasting for in terms of stress or diet?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I have, let's break it down quickly into 3. So I think overall it's hard in the fasting literature to separate caloric restriction. So if you lower calories overall, people are going to lose weight. So sometimes that's gotten muddied in the waters on fasting, because as a matter of fact, they fasted and they also ate less. And so we got weight loss at the end. So I think that's a challenge in the literature. When we think around stress and the way that our brains function in that sort of like fight or flight response, right? Like hunger and not enough resources is a stress to the brain. And so if you're already under a lot of stress, and like, for example, in the burnout, right, it was about meal timing and not having massive hours of fasting, that can really compound our sense of stress anyway, because we're just hungry and our body's like, are we starving? Like literally, like it's so primal in there. We might, just be fasting. I also, as I mentioned, work with a lot of women. And so I find for women, fasting is just more challenging in general, just because the way our brains are wired, where we're much more attuned to those like hunger and starvation from a survival standpoint, and from that hormonal from the brain down. That if it can get in the way of that regular fueling and meeting protein and calcium requirements, it can actually be quite an obstacle. So like with a lot of things, I think case by case and sort of seeing the rest of someone's health in their ecosystem can really make a big difference as well. But from a stress point, I think it's better to eat regularly than to not eat. That's going to be less stressful.
Well, I want to thank both of you, both Dr. Aguilar-Ruiz and Dr. Muthyala, for your incredible presentations. Thank you for your time, and for all of the rest of you that are joining for on the judicial officers. We do have for tomorrow, Dr. Don Porter will be discussing strategies to promote mental wellness. Thursday, Dr. Tammy McCoy Arvalo will be doing a presentation on how to stay positive if giving you some tools to help stay positive. And Friday, it's a more lighthearted affair, and that would be travel and well-being. So it's not too late to sign up if you are available to sign up for those courses. If you have some time, we hope to see you then. And again, thank you to our wonderful presenters. Thank you so much for all your information. I do have one last question for the presenters. I think I got a couple of questions in the chat about the availability of some of the slides. Would those be available to the participants? I don't want to put you on the
No, I actually have a
spot.
link. I have a link that I had prepared and shared with Judge Rosenberg. So let me just grab it because I think that might be the easiest in real time, if you don't mind.
And I think the CJA can also, maybe also with the CLA for the participants who signed up, provide a link after the fact, because they should have a list of the participants who signed up.
Yeah,
I do have, for those who are still on, I think Dr. Aguilera Ruiz did put a link in the chat, and as did Dr. Muthyala. So thank you both again, and everybody have a great rest of your week. Thank you, and hope to see many of you back tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.